The Beaumont case myth, trial by media. What happens when a story becomes more powerful than the evidence? When repetition and headlines take the place of proof? That's what we call a trial by media, and few names show the weight of that. More than Harry Phipps, a man never charged, never convicted, yet remembered through suspicion and story. In this podcast, we put the media itself under the microscope. This podcast is about how stories themselves can become the evidence, how repetition, headlines, and documentaries can shape what we believe, even when the facts remain uncertain. The Beaumont case myth, trial by media, isn't held in a courtroom. It plays out in the media, in books, and in the public imagination. And once a story takes hold, it can be almost impossible to separate perception from proof. One of the clearest examples of this is the way Harry Phipps has been remembered. Over the years, his name has been tied again and again to the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Not through charges or convictions, there were none, but through documentaries, interviews, and retellings that cast him as a suspect. His reputation has been shaped less by evidence than by media, and that's exactly what we're here to explore. In this podcast, we will look at how those media narratives formed, how they were repeated, and what that means for our understanding of both the case and the man at the centre of it. On the 26th of January, 1966, 3 children vanished from Glenelg Beach: Jane 9, Anna 7, and Grant Beaumont 4. Their disappearance became Australia's most haunting mystery. This podcast is not about solving the case. It is about how the story has been told, how memory, media, and repetition have shaped what we think we know. Welcome to the Beaumont case myth, trial by media. In my first podcast, Harry Phipps' Trial by Media, we examined how stories about the Beaumont children have been shaped, reshaped, and repeated. This is not a courtroom. There are no witnesses left to call. What remains are documents, recordings, and the way they have been recycled into public memory. The claim is simple, and it has been repeated often, that Harry Phipps was seen with the Beaumont children on that hot January day in 1966. It sounds definitive, but when we trace it back, the certainty dissolves. The source is not a contemporaneous police file. It is not a sworn statement. It is a recollection decades later, retold in interviews and documentaries until it feels like fact. Repetition is powerful. Each time the claim is retold, it gains weight. A book cites a documentary. A documentary cites a book. Soon the circle is complete, each source pointing to the other, none pointing to the original ground truth. This is how reputations are made and unmade in the court of public opinion. Harry Phipps is no longer here to defend himself. Neither is his son Hayden. What remains is the echo of accusation, amplified by media, etched into public memory. The harm is not abstract. It is reputational, generational, and irreversible. In this, my second podcast, we are not solving the Beaumont case. We are examining how stories about it are told and the danger of repetition without verification. When memory becomes evidence and evidence becomes narrative, the line between history and storytelling. Let us first turn to a single interview, one conversation recorded decades after the Beaumont children vanished, that would cast a long shadow over the reputation of Harry Phipps. It was a voice-recorded interview between Hayden Phipps, Harry's son, and journalist and private investigator Bill Hayes. For many, it became the most damaging testimony ever levelled against Harry. By the time Hayden spoke to Bill Hayes, the Beaumont case had already become folklore. Suspects had come and gone. Theories had multiplied. Hayden's words carried a unique weight, not because they were corroborated by documents or witnesses, but because they came from within the family. An estranged son speaking out against his father. In the court of public opinion, That intimacy gave the interview extraordinary power. It felt like an insider's account. And once broadcast, it was repeated endlessly. In the interview, Hayden described his father in dark and troubling terms. He suggested that Harry was capable of terrible things. But here is the problem. The interview was not evidence. There were no corroborating documents, no contemporaneous statements, no chain of custody, just words spoken decades later, amplified by the authority of broadcast media. Memory is fragile, especially when it is bound up with family trauma. Hayden's recollections may have been sincere, but the tragedy is that Hayden's words became a weapon. They were used to condemn a man who could no longer respond, and they ensured that Harry Phipps's name would forever be linked to the Beaumont case. This podcast shows us how a single interview can reshape public memory, not through evidence, but through emotion, not through corroboration, but through repetition. Hayden's interview with Bill Hayes was not tested in court. It was tested in the arena of public opinion. And in that arena, it became decisive. Every story has a beginning. It began with a phone call. Angela Fife, Hayden Phipps's former wife, reached out to authors Alan Whitaker and Stuart Mullins. That call set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the Beaumont story and forever alter the reputation of Harry Phipps. Angela Fife told authors of that her former husband, Hayden, had confided suspicions about his father, Harry, that he had said things linking Harry to the Beaumont children. This was the spark. Without Angela's call, there may never have been a book, never a documentary. But Angela was not a neutral observer. She was an ex-wife, carrying her own history with Hayden. Her words opened the door, but they also framed the story from the beginning. When Bill Hayes sat down to interview Hayden, it was presented as a breakthrough. Here was Harry's son, speaking directly, describing his father in damning terms. What began with Angela Fife's phone call became a published book, a media cycle, and a reputational trial. In 2018, a television station aired a documentary on the Beaumont children, during which the Bill Hayes audio interview with Hayden Phipps was played. Television gave it weight. A close-up of Hayden's face. A solemn voiceover. The effect was powerful. The audience was left with the impression of certainty. In a courtroom, Hayden's words would have been tested, cross-examined, weighed against documents, timelines, and corroboration. Any suggestion of inducement would have been grounds for exclusion. But on television, none of that mattered. The interview was presented as fact. The editing removed hesitation. The voiceover filled in gaps, creating an atmosphere of inevitability. This is the difference between law and media. Law demands proof. Media demands impact. The Beaumont case was not solved by the documentary, but the reputation of Harry Phipps was judged, and history was reshaped. Authors of a recent book obtained a copy of Hayden's medical records and death certificate, something normally only given to members of the family. Hayden's life was more complicated. He struggled with very serious mental problems and stability. The medical report apparently states that Hayden was on a lot of prescription medications, which together with alcohol could be quite dangerous. Those factors can wear down the body over time, leading to liver failure, heart problems, or a weakened immune system. None of that looks like a single dramatic event, but together they can bring about an early death. When someone knows this information and is asked how Hayden died and responds with a vague answer, then one might assume it may not have been death by natural causes and could even suggest an overdose of medication combined with alcohol. In a courtroom, that would have raised immediate questions about his fitness to testify. But on a television documentary, when none of that is explained and viewers are shown clips that look like testimony without the context that might have discredited it. What the public saw and heard was not a police interview, but a taped conversation between Hayden Phipps and Bill Hayes, later cut and broadcast for television. In law, that's not evidence, it's narrative. And yet, once aired, it carried the weight of testimony in the public imagination. That's the danger of trial by media. A taped conversation can feel like a confession, even when it would never survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. This is where we separate the story from the standard. Media coverage and speculation versus evidence, what the public was told, and what the law would accept. If this taped interview was played in a courtroom, the judge would advise the jury that this witness was in poor health, on heavy medication, and struggling with mental stability. The jury would be advised that without independent corroboration, they were to treat his words with extreme caution, but on television, no such warning was given. Instead, the audience was left to take his words as proof. There is another layer the taped interview did not reveal. Hayden had been married to Angela Fife, a clinical nurse who worked inside correctional centres with sexual offenders. That meant the language of abuse, the psychology of offenders, and the institutional framing of sexual crime were part of Hayden's domestic world. In a courtroom that would raise questions, was Hayden's testimony shaped by his own memory or by the professional discourse he lived alongside? On television, that context was missing. Once again, media reporting was allowed to stand in for evidence. So, in the media, Hayden's words looked like revelation. In the evidence, they were fragile, shaped by health, medication, and even the professional world of his ex-wife. Once again, the story carried more weight on television than it ever could in a courtroom. Distinguished Professor Elizabeth Loftus, one of the world's leading experts on memory, has shown us that recollections are not fixed like videotape. They are malleable, vulnerable to suggestion, and can even be implanted. In her famous 1990s Lost in the Mall study, Elizabeth Loftus ran a simple experiment. She asked people to recall 4 childhood events. 3 were true. 1 was false, a story about being lost in a shopping mall. Within days, a quarter of participants not only remembered the false event, but they also added vivid details: the smell of the store, the hand of the stranger who helped them, the fear in their chest. None of it had ever happened, but to them, it felt real. Now consider Hayden Phipps. He was on heavy medication, struggling with mental health, and had once been married to Angela Fife, a clinical nurse working with sexual offenders. That meant the language of abuse, the psychology of offenders, was part of his domestic life. In Loftus's terms, Hayden was highly suggestible. His memories could have been reshaped, even implanted, not necessarily by malice, but by the environment he lived in. Yet on television, his words were presented as if they were unshakable truth. That is the danger of trial by media. Loftus reminds us, memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. And when reconstruction is broadcast as truth, reputations can be condemned without trial. Hayden said he had come home for lunch after working as a pin boy at Bayside Bowling on that fateful day in January 1966. But here's the truth. The lanes had been automated 2 years earlier. There were no pin boys. He said he was hiding in a cubby house, smoking a cigarette, on a day when Adelaide sweltered past 40 degrees. Yet he implies that the house was empty, so why not smoke inside? These aren't just small slips. In law, they are fatal contradictions. In media, they were left unchallenged. It is reported that in the mid-1990s, Hayden married Angela Fife. On the 8th of November 1996, the paper trail takes us north to Lot 1 on Crown Plan 881456, Struck Oil, Mount Morgan in Queensland. The Commonwealth Bank demands payment of $49,000. There the names appear together. Hayden Henry Phipps and Anne Phipps living at 2 Bain Street, Carindale, Queensland. In some records she is Anne, in others Angela. Was this a clerical variation or two different women? In narrative, the names have been blurred. In evidence, the land record shows a connection. Hayden and Anne Phipps tied to the same property. That's not speculation, that's a government record. Nicholas Phipps, Hayden's son, grew up under the care of his grandparents Harry and wife Olga in Glenelg, in a household now shadowed by secrecy, allegations and control. Nicholas's upbringing is not just a family detail, it's a structural weakness in Hayden's credibility. If he wasn't trusted to raise his own son, how reliable was he as a witness decades later when he accused his father of involvement in the Beaumont case? Nicholas Phipps has spoken publicly about his father Hayden and his grandfather Harry, but he has never, in those interviews, named his mother. Contextual evidence suggests Nicholas was born in the late 1970s to 1980s, son of Hayden Henry Phipps and Christine Mackenzie. The genealogical record tells us Christine Mackenzie was Hayden's first wife. By the time Hayden married Angela Fife in the 1990s, Nicholas was already grown. That's why Angela was never his mother, only his stepmother, and why her obituary never mentions son Nicholas, only Michael. When Nicholas spoke publicly, he did not claim to have seen the Beaumont children himself. He repeated what his father told him. That is hearsay. And yet, in the hands of authors and documentary makers, Nicholas's words were presented as revelation, as confirmation. The nuance was stripped away. What remained was the headline, "Grandson says Harry Phipps was involved." Nicholas described his grandfather Harry as violent, unstable, even monstrous. These were not courtroom depositions. They were interviews, broadcast on television, amplified in print, repeated online. Books and television specials seized on Nicholas's words. They were presented not as fragile recollections, but as confirmation. Confirmation of Harry's guilt. This is how reputational harm takes root. A grandson's words shaped by trauma and family history become evidence in the court of public opinion. The nuance that Nicholas was repeating Hayden's claims, that Hayden himself was unstable, that Nicholas was raised by grandparents Harry and Olga Phipps rather than his own parents, all of that was stripped away. Harry Phipps died in 2004. He cannot defend himself. His family has lived under a cloud of suspicion, fueled not by evidence, but by media. Even his niece has spoken out against what she calls fabricated reporting, and a smear campaign that has harmed both the Phipps and Beaumont families alike. In the media, Harry Phipps is the villain who fits the story. In evidence, the case against him collapses under scrutiny. This is the essence of trial by media, a man's reputation destroyed not by proof, but by repetition. A family condemned, not by evidence, but by story. And so, in the balance of fairness, in the pursuit of truth, we must say it plainly, the case against Harry Phipps is not proven. The evidence is fragile, the testimony compromised, the narrative seductive but hollow. Harry Phipps deserves, at the very least, the presumption of innocence that every citizen is entitled to. There is another name that surfaces in the shadows of the Beaumont case, a name less familiar than Harry Phipps, but one that carries its own dark weight. Anthony Allen Munro. Munro was a former Scout leader, a repeat child sex offender, a man whose crimes stretch back to the 1960s, the very years when the Beaumont children vanished. He was later convicted of abusing boys at Rapid Bay, Glenelg and Kangaroo Island, places and times that overlap with the Beaumont timeline. Victims like Andrew McIntyre have spoken publicly, saying Munro preyed on them for years. McIntyre has even suggested that Munro may have known more about the Beaumont children, that he may have been involved, or at the very least, that he carried secrets about what happened that day. Police did question Munro when he returned from Cambodia in 2016, but no charges were ever laid in connection with the Beaumont case. Officially, there is no evidence tying him to the children's disappearance. This is where media and evidence collide once again. In narrative, Munro fits the role of the predator lurking in plain sight. In evidence, the case remains unproven. But to understand the fragility of the Beaumont story, we must at least consider the Munro hypothesis and ask whether the wrong man has carried the weight of suspicion for too long. The first books on the Beaumont case promised answers. They offered theories, suspects, and timelines. But when we look closely, we see something else. Repetition of earlier reporting, speculation presented as fact, and the subtle power of print to transform uncertainty into authority. Once in print, a later book would quote an earlier one. A documentary would cite both. Soon, the circle was complete. And once a claim is in print, it is rarely questioned. Instead, it is repeated. And with each repetition, it grows heavier, harder to dislodge. Books do more than tell stories. They shape reputations. When an author names a suspect, even cautiously, the effect is lasting. The name becomes attached to the case. The suspicion lingers. For Harry Phipps, this was the beginning of a reputational trial. A trial without evidence, without defense, without end. Books, more than newspapers, give permanence to speculation. They turn uncertainty into narrative, and narrative into verdict. From the pages in books to the screen, where television documentaries amplified these claims with images, sound, and the power of performance. When Angela Fife first contacted the authors, she set in motion a story that would grow far beyond her. Her account of what Hayden had said about his father became the seed of circumstantial media speculation. Then came Hayden's interview with Bill Hayes, broadcast with gravity, repeated in print, and amplified on television. It gave the impression of insider testimony. In 2013, two men claimed they dug a hole at Harry Phipps's Castalloy factory at North Plympton, South Australia, during the Australia Day long weekend in January 1966. Police excavated the site. Nothing was found. A second dig in 2018, prompted by media pressure, also found nothing. Decades of searching, and not a single piece of physical evidence has ever tied Harry Phipps to the Beaumont children. Together, these moments created momentum. They gave journalists, authors, and eventually politicians the justification to demand action. And action, in this case, meant digging. In 2013, 2018, and again in 2025, excavators rolled into the old Castalloy factory site in Adelaide, where Harry Phipps had been the managing director in 1966. Each time the promise was the same: perhaps at last, the Beaumont children would be found. Each time, nothing was discovered. In the recent 2025 dig, almost 10,000 tonnes of soil were shifted. Forensic archaeologists supervised. Cameras rolled, and once again, nothing was found. But the absence of discovery did not end the story. Each dig was treated as confirmation that the site was significant. Each failure was framed not as disproof, but as a reason to dig again. The 2025 dig was not just an excavation, it was a performance. Television crews broadcast live updates. Social media buzzed with speculation. But for the Phipps family, it was another wound. Each new excavation revived the association between Harry Phipps and the Beaumont case. Even though nothing was found, not in 2013, not in 2018, not in 2025, The public memory absorbed the image of excavators digging at the Castelloy factory. The entire theory of a grave at Castelloy rested on the recollections of two men who, as boys, claimed they were paid by Harry Phipps to dig a hole at the factory on the Australia Day long weekend in January 1966. They described the day as hot, stinking hot. But the weather records for the Australia Day long weekend tell a different story. Adelaide was cool, even mild, with maximums in the low 20s. Their memory did not match the climate of the time, yet those statements, fragile, inconsistent, and decades removed from the event, were treated as credible enough to justify 3 separate excavations at the Castelloy site. Each dig consumed police resources, public money, and media attention, and each ended the same way, with nothing found. What remained was not evidence, but the spectacle of searching and the reputational damage inflicted by a story that never aligned with the facts. The contrast is stark. The memory insists on oppressive heat. The record shows a cool holiday long weekend. The disappearance of the Beaumont children is no longer just a case. It is a national myth. A story retold so many times that the line between fact and fiction has blurred. In this podcast, we have explored how myths are made, how memory is reshaped, and how misinformation becomes indistinguishable from truth. We now refer to the work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, whose 50 years of research has shown us just how fragile memory really is. In her famous 1974 experiment with John Palmer, participants watched a film of a car accident. When asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other, they gave lower estimates than when asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. A single word changed their memory. Some even recalled broken glass that was never there. This is called the misinformation effect. Post-event information, leading questions, suggestive phrasing, repetition can alter what people believe they saw. Memory is malleable, and once reshaped, it feels just as real as the original. Now, using her valuable research, let's run our own Loftus-style memory experiments. These are my own experiments and not to be taken as those of Elizabeth Loftus. You are shown the actual family obituary from the Bow Desert Times in Queensland, dated September 13th, 2017. Fife, Angela Late of Coralbin, aged 73 years. Dearly loved mother and mother-in-law of Lisa and Shane, Dita and Belinda, and Michael. The experimenter leans in and suggests Anne Michael. That could well be Michael Barry Fife. But here's the catch. In real life, Michael Barry Fife is not a neutral name on a page. He is a South Australian prisoner, infamous for stabbing and killing disgraced ex-police officer and sex predator Anthony Trevor Tilley in 1995. Michael was already serving a long sentence. Michael Fife has spent decades in solitary for his attacks on child predators. Michael Fife and his sister were physically and sexually abused for years by their violently depraved father and then abandoned by his mother when he was just 13 years old. Michael spent years in institutions where he was further victimized. He has spent decades in prison, much of it in solitary confinement, and has spoken openly about seeing himself as judge and executioner against sexual predators. Michael is 63 years old in 2025, so his birth year would be 1962. Angela Fife was born in 1944, making her around 18 years old when Michael was born. So biologically, it is possible that Angela was his mother. Now we return to the experiment. The obituary never said this Michael was that Michael, yet the actual history and suggestion plants the association. The human mind, eager for coherence, begins to fuse the obituaries and Michael with the notorious prisoner. Soon, the link feels natural, even inevitable. This is the danger Loftus research warns us about, how a single cue paired with authoritative suggestion can implant a potentially false connection. What begins as a hypothesis, maybe this Michael is her son, can harden into accepted fact, not because the evidence proves it, but because the story may have been rehearsed and repeated. We can end up remembering a connection that may never have existed. Now, imagine you are a subject in another memory experiment. A photograph taken in Queensland is circulating showing Hayden Phipps seated, with a man named Peter Stafford, a cousin of Hayden, standing behind him. Standing alongside Peter Stafford is one of the authors of an earlier book who just happens to know that Hayden has over $200,000 in the bank. Unusual for an author to know that private information. The experimenter leans in and adds a suggestion. You know, Peter Stafford is a financial advisor, so why is he there in the photograph? You are told Hayden may have been paid for his interview with Bill Hayes, during which he made terrible accusations about his father, Harry Phipps. Notice what happens in your mind. The photograph itself is neutral. Two men standing together, leaning over a seated Hayden. But the added suggestion of payment transforms it. Suddenly, the image feels like evidence of collusion, of financial inducement, of compromised testimony after seeing a photograph and a whispered insinuation. This is precisely the mechanism Loftus research demonstrated. The human mind doesn't just record, it edits, it fills gaps, it fuses suggestion with perception. Soon the audience may remember that Hayden was paid, or that the photograph proves a financial arrangement, even though the evidence itself never states that. What began as a hypothesis, maybe Hayden was paid, hardens into a narrative fact, not because the record proves it, but because the story has been paired with visual cues. In the court of public opinion, that is how reputations are made and unmade. In my final experiment, you are handed a family tree. On one branch, you see Nicholas Phipps. The experimenter suggests that must be Angela Fyfe's son. Yet lineage is documented in genealogical records which show Nicholas is the son of Hayden Phipps and Christine Mackenzie. Still, the suggestion lingers, and the mind begins to weave the connection. Once the suggestion is planted, your mind begins to fuse the two. The name Nicholas, the surname Phipps, the proximity of family lines, all of it conspires to make the association feel plausible. Soon you may remember that Angela Fyfe had a son named Nicholas, even though the evidence shows otherwise. It now becomes logical why Nicholas was brought up by his grandparents, Harry and his wife, Olga. Also, why Nicholas was not mentioned in Angela's obituary. Now pause. You've been through 3 demonstrations. Each began with an actual stimulus, an obituary, a photograph, a family tree. Each was paired with a suggestion by the experimenter. And each time, the human mind may have begun to fuse the two, creating a memory or belief that feels real, even when the evidence may not support it. So I ask you, as Loftus would ask her subjects, could you now believe these 3 theories? Could you believe Michael Barry Fyfe was Angela's son, or that Hayden was paid for his interview, or that Nicholas belonged to Angela's line? This is not about proving or disproving those claims. It is about showing how easily suggestion can shape what we think we know. In the court of public opinion, as in the laboratory, memory and evidence are fragile. And that fragility is at the heart of this podcast, not accusation, but examination. So again, I ask you, as Loftus would ask her subjects, could you now believe this theory? Could you believe that Angela's professional world somehow bled into Hayden's testimony? The point is not whether it happened. The point is how easily the human mind can be led to believe it did. And that fragility between evidence and suggestion is what this podcast is about. Theories are repeated until they feel inevitable. Suspects are named until their reputations are permanently tied to the case. Excavations are staged until the act of digging itself becomes part of the myth. This is how misinformation becomes myth, not through lies, but through repetition, suggestion, and the slow erosion of doubt. Elizabeth Loftus' 50-year study into planting misinformation into the human mind and the malleability of memory is not just a theory, it has consequences. For the Phipps family, it has meant reputational ruin. For the public, it meant mistaking media reports for truth. The myth comforts us with the illusion of certainty, but it also blinds us to the fragility of memory and the harm caused when speculation is repeated as fact. The Beaumont case is not just a mystery, it is a textbook example of the misinformation effect. Elizabeth Loftus proved that memory can be reshaped by suggestion. The Beaumont story proves that entire societies can be reshaped the same way. In this podcast, we have traced how the disappearance of the Beaumont children became more than a mystery. It became a story retold, reshaped, and repeated until it hardened into myth. We have seen how memory falters, how repetition creates authority, how interviews and documentaries amplify fragility into certainty, and how excavations turn speculation into spectacle. Harry Phipps was never charged. He was never tried. He was never given the chance to defend himself in court, and yet, in the court of public opinion, he was tried repeatedly by books, by documentaries, by interviews, by excavations. This was a trial without rules, no cross-examination, no standards of admissibility, no protection against inducement, just media reporting, repeated until it became its own form of judgment. Myths are powerful. They give us meaning. They help us explain the inexplicable. But myths also have victims. The cost of myth is measured not only in what we believe, but in who we harm by believing it. For the Phipps family, it has meant reputational ruin. The verdict of trial by media is it delivers punishment without proof, and that leaves no path for acquittal. This podcast has not solved the Beaumont case. It was never meant to. What it has done is expose the fragility of evidence, the power of repetition, and the human cost of myth. The disappearance of Jane, Anna, and Grant remains unsolved, but the reputational trial of Harry Phipps has already been decided, not in court, but in the media. And so we end where we began, with a mystery that refuses resolution and with a reminder that stories once told can be as powerful and as destructive as any verdict. We've walked through books, interviews, documentaries, and excavations. We've seen how memory can be reshaped, how myths can grow, and how reputations can be destroyed without a single day in court. For me, this has always been about fairness, about recognizing the fragility of evidence and the human cost when speculation is mistaken for truth. If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this: history is not fixed. It is shaped by the way we tell it. And we all have a responsibility to question the stories we inherit, especially when those stories carry the weight of accusation. Thank you for listening to Trial by Media. Thank you for giving your time to reflect on how memory, myth, and media shape our understanding of the past. And above all, thank you for remembering that behind every story are real people, real families, and reputations that deserve the same care as the truth itself.